Let me thank Ambassador Lee and the organizers for the wonderful hospitality. It's truly a pleasure to be in the Republic of Korea every time. And it's an honor to be able to help on this issue, truly, as a personal commitment. Let me turn to our panelists who've been introduced already. So I will not go into their full CVs, but just to say a very warm welcome to my left to Signe Poulsen, OHCHR. Sok Yong Choi, former ambassador, dear friend. Christine Chung, who's now with Leiden Asia Center in HRNK, formerly with OHHR. David Hawke, a long-time activist on DPRK matters. Jared Genser, likewise, and also a great lawyer and writer. And then Dong Ho Han from the Center for North Korean Human Rights Studies. Let's give them a warm welcome. This morning, we heard about the what and the who. And now, it's about the how and a little bit of where next. The what this morning was crimes against humanity, main focus. But please don't forget many other violations which are not necessarily crimes against humanity. And the who, interestingly, could be various. It could be the top individual. It could be a group, security people, maybe, a ministry. And it could be the state in a certain way, in terms of different types of responsibilities. State, group, individual. Interesting. But crimes against humanity are advocated most against individuals, individual criminal responsibility. And now we come to the what, the why, where, how, next. Having discussed what, let's how next in terms of mechanisms. And I would just like to make very short points to lead into this in terms of the how. And that is, number one, it is welcome that the North Korean human rights issue is now part and parcel of the formal agenda of the Security Council. That's been a brilliant tactic, particularly by the Commission of Inquiry and friends, to push it up into the Security Council. And yet there's a quandary as to what next when it's there already. Can we really push it, the agenda, to the International Criminal Court or not? And what do we do while waiting? Secondly, it is welcome that there is a substantial vote consistently in the General Assembly of the United Nations for this issue, including accountability. So how are we to go about next? Can we use the GA, General Assembly, a bit more? Thirdly, we have sanctions against North Korea imposed by the Security Council in relation to the nuclear and ballistic issues, touching a little bit on human rights. But we have no sanctions from the UN in real terms on human rights, not from the Security Council. Is that something to be thought about? Fourthly, the Human Rights Council will soon appoint a new special rapporteur, as well as a high-level panel of experts to push the accountability issue. So what is happening here is very, very important in terms of the messaging, the communication of what we should do next in regard to the how, knowing that the what we know about to some extent in terms of crimes against humanity, while not forgetting the other violations at other levels. So with that in mind, I will turn to our dear colleagues here to sound out how they see the how, the mechanisms, the instruments, the processes next, bearing in mind the what and the who and for whom that we've been talking about. So I'll just go around. Signe.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank Ambassador Lee. I can only imagine what you've gone through to set up this beautiful event that's fantastically organized with all the right people here. So thank you very much on behalf of OHCHR Seoul. I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you how this morning, but what I maybe will talk a little bit about is how we figure out how, because this is really what the UN is presently looking at. You'll all know our office has been working for the past year under a mandate which includes monitoring, i.e. Figuring out actually what we discussed very much in the first session. What do we do with the second session, with this question of how? Well, it's not very straightforward because internationally, these truth and reconciliation and justice processes have been challenging. They've not always succeeded, although they are having, as Justice Song pointed out in the beginning, a very significant and important impact, and they indeed are having an increasing impact, I believe. What is the UN doing at the moment? Well, last month in the Human Rights Council, a resolution was passed or adopted, calling for the establishment of a group of independent experts. And the mandate of this group will be exactly to look at how, to outline the different options that exist, to look at domestic and international systems, and to figure out more broadly the technical and specific ways of how we can move forward on this justice issue. The International Criminal Court, of course, remains an urgent and important part of this, but also looking at what else can be pursued given the international context. This does not take away from the need for international accountability for those guilty of, or suspected of, I should say, crimes against humanity and other very grave crimes and human rights violations. So how does this fit with the office of OHCHR Seoul? Well, I see our role very much as continuing our investigation of who and what and which violations, as well as raising awareness and doing technical cooperation and capacity building where this is possible and useful, including with relevant governments, but also working very closely with civil society, think tanks and others. So in this way, the mandate of what we will have as a group of independent experts and the Office of Seoul will be very complementary and will support one another so that we move towards a stronger overall result. In terms of how, as was mentioned in the previous session, yes, accountability and justice through criminal processes is a very important part of that, and we have the ICC, but indeed we also have domestic processes that could possibly be looked into and how they might apply. But in addition to that, the UN has a wide range of experience from across the world in transitional justice mechanisms, the different tools that exist, such as was mentioned before, but also the general principles that one needs to take into account when applying such tools. And this includes things like addressing root causes and root structures. It includes things like important awareness of the political context, but also the cultural context in which you operate. Of course, it includes paying particular attention to groups that have traditionally been marginalized, women, children, and others. And it includes centering on the victims, so ensuring that victims' needs, and these may be in themselves diverse, are also honored and respected and listened to in a genuine way. As was mentioned before, of course, the role of civil society in these processes is extremely important and forms a foundation for all of the work we are undertaking. So I hope now we've done our first year as OHCHR Seoul, and I hope in the second year that we'll continue to broaden and expand on our work and our monitoring, as well as awareness raising and reaching out. I believe we are having an impact, not as OHCHR Seoul, but as an international community with so many parties working with each other. We have governments, we have civil society, we have academics, media, and many others who contribute to this greater human rights protection and cause. So in the coming year, we hope to continue our work, to broaden and deepen it, and then to continue the activism and momentum that we so often spoke of, the need to retain after the Commission of Inquiry report came out. And the group of independent experts indeed is one tool for doing so and for moving the debate forward. I think I'll stop here, and you can all ask questions later if you have more.
Thank you very much, Signy, for the how of how. Let me next move to Ambassador Choi.
Thank you, Professor, for giving me floor. At the outset, I also would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Lee for organizing this important event. I also pay tribute to the Troika of COI, who just made a remarkable achievement for the last couple of years in the issues of North Korean human rights. And I also pay tribute to the Honorable Professor Song Sang-hyun, who used to be the president of the ICC, which is one of the most important organizations in the UN system in handling the accountability issues. We heard very interesting discussions on who is accountable for what actions. We heard a lot of interesting ideas and inspiring thought about that. Already COI, when they published the report, they went through the how issues. They suggested maybe appropriate judicial codes could be established inside of the crime scene in North Korea or elsewhere. But those two possibilities is not available at the moment. COI also suggested two other avenues, either establishing ad hoc tribunal, just like in the case of Rwanda and Yugoslavia. That option is not available either. And another option is using the avenue of ICC. Actually, there are two avenues in utilizing ICC. Those avenues are not available at the moment in the case of North Korean human rights situations. Then under these circumstances, what we should do, the only option what we can do until such a time, any of such option would be available. Actually, we have to accumulate the evidences of the crimes which are being committed inside and outside of North Korea. We need to carry out in-depth mapping of institutions and individuals who are responsible for the crime of humanities in North Korea. And at the same time, I think the Human Rights Council and also the treaty bodies, we have 10 treaty bodies in the UN system in addressing human rights issues, should continue to deal with accountability questions. It may not be easy to take up accountability of North Korean human rights issues at the Human Rights Council as an independent agenda items, but the members of the Human Rights Council can raise the issues and continue to discuss. United Nations General Assembly and Security Council can also be used as a forum for continued discussions on North Korea's human rights issues. And also independent panel of experts in addressing accountability can be also useful channel to study the accountability issues. At the same time, I also would like to draw attention to the accountability, the responsibility of international community in protecting and promotion of North Korean the human rights. One is we need to provide assistance, not only material assistance to the refugees of North Koreans, or we also need to provide psychological or mental support for those who are found outside of North Korea. The reason why I'm talking about this, and I was very much impressed by the statement by the young North Korean defectors who are studying in United States and UK. They just confessed that we found our own special identity when we were outside of North Korea as North Korean defectors. And what we need is not only material assistance, but also an psychological encouragement and recognizing the special identity of North Korean defectors. It was quite impressive for me. The second, the principle of non-refoulement should be implemented, and we need to give pressure for those countries in transit for North Korean defectors to exercise the principle of non-refoulement as much as possible. And I also agree with the transitional justice process is also very important. But the issue of transitional justice in regard to the North Korean human rights questions is quite sensitive issues. There is a need to study in advance, but it is quite sensitive, politically sensitive. Therefore, we need to avoid any unnecessary preemptive actions in addressing the transitional justice process in North Korean human rights issues. I have to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very useful in terms of the various options pertaining to the how. Thirdly, we come to Christine.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Ambassador Lee, for organizing such an interesting program and for including me with such interesting and wonderful colleagues who work on North Korea. I have a few points I'd like to make on this question of accountability and how. I attended a lecture recently in Geneva with the ICC chief prosecutor, and what she focused on was about cooperation between the ICC and the human rights mechanisms in Geneva, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And what she spoke about was the principle of complementarity. And so I think what's interesting in the North Korea context is after unification, what that means in terms of complementarity. Is there a national process that has to take place before you can actually have the ICC take up the issue of the human rights violations in North Korea? That was one issue. The other issues that were raised for me when I was thinking about this panel is about the historical examples that are available to us in considering the North Korea case. And one thing I was focused on for a while after the Commission of Inquiry wrapped up its work was the example of Russia, the example of the Soviet Union and the Gulag, the hidden Gulag, the author sitting next to me. I think North Korea has used the term Gulag, or not North Korea has used the term, but we use the term to refer to the prison camps in North Korea as gulags. And that terminology actually comes from Russia, and that was an acronym for their main camp administration. And if we look at the example of the Soviet Union, it's interesting, there were over 470 some camps as part of this system that existed from about consolidated in the 1920s. It was only shut down in 1986. And when this was shut down, it was hard to estimate the number of people who've passed through the system. Anne Applebaum has done quite a bit of interesting writing on the Gulag. Her book is, I think, a very excellent read. But her estimate was 18 million people passed through the labor camps in the Soviet Union, and 15 million additionally have experienced forced labor. Now, the question that came to my mind was how many people were prosecuted for the crimes that were committed in this system with the Gulag? And the answer is actually none. I mean, nobody was held to account for what happened not that long ago in the Soviet Union. In 1992, Russia rehabilitated all the victims of political repression, but there's still no prosecution of any individual responsible for the suffering that came through the labor camps. The other example that came to my mind when I thought about North Korea and accountability is East Germany. And of course, with East Germany, you have the parallels with the process of unification, and you have some crimes that have equivalences, I guess. You've got the surveillance system that was quite entrenched. I'm not going to speak at length about the parallels, but what's interesting, again, in East Germany was when, upon unification, you had prosecutions of East German leaders and also of border guards who were responsible for shooting and killing East Germans who were escaping to the West. But the prosecutions were done under East German law. They were done in national courts. And I think, again, the lessons about accountability there, if we look at the leadership, Erich Honecker, he was the leader of East Germany from 1971 to 1989. And he was brought to trial in 1992. And he actually got he had 70 minutes, he had his say in the court. But in the end, he was deemed too ill to serve out any kind of sentence. He sent back to Chile, and he died in 1994. We have the next, Erich Mielke, head of the Stasi. He was deemed unfit for trial for the crimes that were committed as his role as the head of the Stasi. And he actually only served 2 years of a sentence for murder from a different period. And even though he was deemed unfit for trial in 1993, he died in 2000. He died 7 years later. So those are two examples, I think, that we can look at, but one that might be even more interesting is the recent example in Chad. And there you actually do have a case of accountability that was taken perhaps to a more satisfactory ending. And there you had the extraordinary African chambers in Senegal. And the former leader of Chad was sentenced to life in prison for torture, for rape, for sexual slavery, for executions. And what's interesting in this situation, I think, was it took 16 years to reach that sentence. It took 16 years. There was a very significant role of civil society in seeing this through. And the how here was universal jurisdiction. And I think it's an interesting principle for us to be looking at also in the North Korean context. Perhaps Kim Jong-un doesn't like to travel outside of the country for reasons that may be related to universal jurisdiction and others as well. But there are, as individuals noted in the previous panel, quite a few other leaders and other North Koreans who have less resistance to traveling to places where universal jurisdiction could be applied. I'll stop there just for the sake of time, but those were just some of the ideas, not necessarily put together to a very satisfying thesis or anything, but my thoughts on accountability.
Thank you very much, Christine. Very useful. Different entry points, not forgetting the national level. David.
Thank you. And I'd like to join other panelists in thanking Ambassador Lee for organizing the conference, along with the other organizers, and for inviting me in particular. On the bus this morning from the hotel to the conference center, on the basis of what Vita told me about, I've completely reconsidered what it was I was thinking and going to say. Prior to talking to Vita, I was going to say, one, I hoped that the accountability panel authorized by the Human Rights Council would come up with something imaginative. But until then, as long as there are 9 procedural votes at the UN Security Council, it seemed to me important to have the annual discussion of the human rights situation in the DPRK at the Security Council. And as long as you can get, or the other states, the other governments, can get 115 to 120 votes on the General Assembly resolutions that recognize North Korea's violations as crimes against humanity and call for an ICC referral, then it was very important for that exercise to continue. But I was trying to think on the plane ride on the way over here, what would be the steps if there were an ICC referral? The next step would be for the prosecutor's office to spend 1, 2, 3 years doing the investigation that would be necessary to prepare an indictment of particular persons to be held responsible. My knowledge of how international judicial institutions work is very limited, but the two that I do know a little bit about, the ad hoc tribunal on Rwanda and the mixed tribunal in Cambodia, it did take a year or 2 or 3 for the accountability investigations to proceed before indictments were drawn up. So I was thinking, I wonder if there's any possibility under UN auspices for accountability investigations of the sort that would be done by investigating judges or the prosecutor's office before or in the absence of an ICC referral. And what Vita told me about this morning, that in fact there's a marvelous precedent on Syria, that the COI on Syria has been conducting the kinds of investigations into accountability that the prosecutor's office would do, and has been doing this for several years under the authority of the Human Rights Council. Now, Vita also told me that this is the 5th year of the Syria COI, and that they've got a staff of 25. The Seoul office has a wonderful, expansive mandate, but I would not think the resources necessary to conduct accountability investigations. But there is precedent. Maybe we could turn the tables and call on our moderator to describe a bit how pre-indictment accountability investigations are being taken under UN auspices in the case of Syria. It has to be under UN auspices. The kinds of people the courts bring in as investigators really don't have terrible much use for the previous research of academics or NGOs. They tend to do it all over again for themselves. But I now think that it ought to be possible for the Council to authorize accountability investigations and documentations of the sort that the prosecutor's office at the ICC might do if there was if there ever was a referral. How that would work has to be thought about by people who know more about the UN processes and the operations of prosecutors' offices than I do. But I now think that it really ought to be possible to begin those sorts of investigations and analyses and documentation in advance of an ICC referral.
Thank you very much, David. That's very useful. You have traveled well today on the bus and more. The message, I think, is this: importance of documentation, investigation, prosecution, and enforcement. And we can enter at different points. And starting now. Jared.
So I want to do three things in my brief remarks this morning. First, I'm going to start on a contrarian note, given the title of our panel and the discussion. As a lawyer, I like to occasionally be contrary. Second, I want to speak about the how, which of course was what Vidit asked us to do. And then lastly, I want to end on a hopeful note, talking about a very different situation, the situation in Burma, Myanmar, and my own involvement in it as it related to the Security Council, which hopefully can also just be something that we keep in mind. First, the contrary note. I understand this whole discussion today is about shifting the gear on accountability, but I want to be clear up front as an international human rights lawyer that this is going to be no panacea for the problems of North Korea. It's important to remember that in the 20th century, more than 100 million people were killed, civilians killed, in conflicts and non-conflict situations, more than 100 million killed. Less than 950 people were ever prosecuted for those crimes. Less than 950, okay? So even if we get the gold standard of an ICC prosecution, the number of people in North Korea that will be held to account for crimes happening in North Korea, present and past, is going to be on maybe two hands, right? 15, 10 people maybe. You don't see more than that per country typically at the ICC. This is why I have always believed, and I continue to believe, that while of course we need to proceed very strenuously down the path of accountability and justice, we also have to equally pursue ameliorating the suffering of the North Korean people, and candidly, my own personal view is leading to ultimately a change in the system of government, a reunification with the South, whatever is going to happen down the road that will transform the lives of the North Korean people. And justice and accountability is not going to transform the lives of the North Korean people. So that's my contrary note that I'd begin with, or cautionary note, I guess I would say. So we all agree that the goal here is to create a mechanism for justice and accountability in North Korea, or to access one like the ICC. And to me, there are at least two key ways that we go about doing that. The first, which has been discussed that I won't dwell on, is gathering the evidence and hearing the stories from victims, identifying perpetrators, documenting that in the highest quality way possible that will be consistent with the kind of standards that international justice would ultimately require. It isn't merely, though, for future accountability purposes. It's also, I think, for the victims to have their stories, to be able to tell their stories, for them to be able to point a finger at perpetrators and to accuse people of having committed serious crimes, and to have the validation that they deserve in the intervening period between now and when maybe justice might come down the road, that what they went through was horrible, horrific, terrible, the worst that could happen that one human being does to another human being, that it's wrong, that it's illegal under international law, and that the international community acknowledges the injustice that has taken place by merely hearing that story, documenting that story, and telling that story. And so that is something that will be, and I also would love to hear Vidit talk a little bit more about the Syrian COI experience and documentation experience, because I think it's very valid for thinking about the DPRK. The other key way, though, that I think that we need to go about this, which was mentioned earlier by Greg Scarletou, is to build global support for justice and accountability. As a lawyer, I like facts, and I think that gathering the evidence and identifying victims and perpetrators and hearing their stories and letting them testify firsthand isn't just about facts for justice and accountability, but it's also about persuasion. It's about telling the world what's really happening in North Korea so that there is an impetus to take action to address it. And building a global effort to achieve justice and accountability requires what Vidin Mutavorn said in one of his early reports as the DPRK Special Rapporteur. I'm one of the people who read every single one of his reports that he wrote, and the subsequent reports by, of course, Marzuki Darsman and the COI have been stellar, really, truly stellar. He talked about using the entirety of the UN system, engaging the entirety of the UN system, because the situation is so bad that there's no one single way to go about this. And he was talking in his opening remarks about the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council. We need to look at every means of engaging North Korea to achieve justice and accountability. That is the only way we have any hope of making any meaningful progress. In the more near term, one of the ideas that's been bandied about and that is being discussed is the creation of a mock tribunal on North Korea that would try to bring to life what a prosecution might actually look like. And I believe that that's a very helpful step forward for the global movement for justice and accountability, because I think that it is the kind of thing that, if done right with the kinds of people that we would intend to engage to do it, it can point a very bright light on what's happening in North Korea today by using victim testimony firsthand and telling that story publicly, by naming perpetrators, and by trying to bring to life in a way that can be digested by the media and the world, to tell individual stories. Because at the end of the day, the enormity of the horrors of North Korea are so large that, as unfortunately Joseph Stalin said, 1 million deaths is a statistic, a single death is a tragedy. And we can get lost in the enormity of the crimes, but what we really need to do is to see the human faces of the people that have actually been the victims, to have them tell their stories, to have their stories accessible to the world. That is what will move hearts and minds. That is what we need to force political leaders to take action. And so I do think that that would be a very helpful next step, and I know that there's some discussions underway about that. I would strongly encourage it, and am also hoping to be able to help with it as well. Let me just end on a brief story about the situation of Burma, Myanmar, and the UN Security Council, which is an example of where, while at a particular moment in time there was no hope that substantial things were able to happen through the Security Council and change was able to happen in the country of Burma, Myanmar. In 2005, I was commissioned pro bono by Václav Havel and Desmond Tutu to produce a report called Threat to the Peace, a call for the UN Security Council to act on Burma. And we laid out a highly detailed case as to why Burma should be placed on the UN Security Council agenda. Much like North Korea at the time, every other part of the UN system had engaged on Myanmar. You had 15 resolutions before the Commission on Human Rights and Human Rights Council, another 15 resolutions at the General Assembly, reports galore from NGOs and the world on these issues. And with a concerted global push, and frankly with Václav Havel and Desmond Tutu leading the charge, we were able within 1 year to get Burma and Myanmar on the Security Council agenda. Now, we ran into a double veto by China and Russia of a resolution that was introduced in January of 2007. And obviously that was an incredibly disappointing result. Not a surprising one, given Myanmar's close relationship with China. But nevertheless, much like the situation in North Korea today, it remained on the UN Security Council agenda, because once you're on the permanent agenda of the Council by a vote of 9, it takes 9 votes to remove it, and typically situations only get removed over time when they haven't been discussed for multiple years in a row. And so one would have thought in January of 2007 there was no hope that the Council would do anything on Myanmar. And yet, in September of 2007, there was the so-called Saffron Revolution, where the monks and the people marched in the streets. 25, 30 protesters were gunned down. And China, in particular in that case, couldn't stand in the way of the Security Council ultimately adopting a presidential statement by consensus that actually laid out a roadmap to the transition that ultimately took place. And the Security Council presidential statement that was from September 2007 talked about the need for reconciliation through dialogue between the military the National League for Democracy and ethnic groups. It talked about the need for the release of political prisoners. It talked about the need for open access for humanitarian assistance. And it was a long road between there and ultimately the transition that took place. But Myanmar has now been discussed in the Security Council about 20 times between September 2000, when it was put on the agenda in 2006 and present. The transition has happened in Myanmar. I'm actually going there in a week. We'll be seeing Aung San Suu Kyi in her new role. I subsequently spent 5 years as her international lawyer. And the country still has a long way to go. It's a very fragile democracy, to say the least. But I will tell you that back then, when I was working on Myanmar, this was a brutal military dictatorship that had burned more than 1,000 villages to the ground, created more than 1 million refugees, engaged 70,000 children as child soldiers, 700,000 people in forced labor, huge human rights abuses, dramatic human rights abuses. A military dictatorship from 1962, long-standing. Not quite as long as North Korea, but very long-standing. And the situation has changed. And Nelson Mandela said that nobody believed it was possible until it happened. And so I say that because, of course, there are dramatic differences between North Korea and Myanmar. I could go on for a long time about how different the situations are in many different respects. But sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and all of us are working here at being good about developing the ability to gather the evidence and the information, documenting things, preparing for justice and accountability. We do not know what will happen with North Korea. Nobody knows. But we are very well positioned with the Security Council. We are very well positioned overall to take full advantage of the moment in time when this happens, and I do believe that it is inevitable. And I think that what has happened in the situation in Myanmar, which you saw with Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy's election last fall, and they're taking office just a few months ago, that things can actually change. And you saw the end to an almost 50-year plus military dictatorship in Myanmar, and we will see an end to the Kim dynasty in North Korea as well. And it's just a question of when, not whether. And I think that, to me, gives me hope, and it only reinforces the need for us to stay strong and to continue to press forward.
Thank you, Jared. Very, very useful indeed. A roadmap on accountability is emerging and will emerge. Dong Ho.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to appreciate Yonsei Center for Human Liberty and ICNK for organizing this important event and giving me an opportunity to exchange ideas regarding North Korean human rights. I also would like to appreciate UN Seoul office for their efforts to promote human rights in North Korea. At KINU, me and my colleagues regularly meet with North Korean refugees who settled in South Korea and make an in-depth interview with each individual North Korean refugee. The main goal of our interview is to investigate whether each individual experienced human rights violations within North Korea and or during escaping North Korea. We also aim to gather important information regarding human rights violations in North Korea. Every year, we interview more than 200 North Korean refugees, and based on our interview, report the results by publishing white paper on human rights in North Korea. Now, my key question today is how can we develop an effective strategy to improve North Korean human rights and raise the accountability issue relevant to North Korean human rights violators? Frankly speaking, I have no smart answer for this question, but to answer this question, I believe we should consider the following 3 points, which I will talk about from now on. First, to resolve the accountability issue and make whole situation be feasible, we need more concrete information and data regarding North Korean human rights perpetrators. These perpetrators could be the North Korean state itself, the core government agencies and institutions such as State Security Department, and individuals such as high-ranking official or low-ranking officials. The problem is, it is very hard to have clear information of these perpetrators. When I interview with many North Korean refugees, mostly they remember the fact that they experienced human rights violations, but they have no clear information about perpetrators. There is difficulty that a lot of North Korean refugees in South Korea have no detailed information on perpetrators. In other words, interviewing North Korean refugees, investigators could easily find out that victims exist, but there is no existence of the perpetrators. It is relatively easy to clarify whether North Korean refugees experienced human rights violations. It is hard, however, to prove who will be held accountable for that particular human rights violation. In some cases, it could be argued that North Korean state itself would be the main cause for particular human rights violations. Because North Korea is a totalitarian state, and punishment and control of its own citizens are general phenomena of implementing the state's social control policies. Many North Koreans still have no clear sense of the idea of human rights, and as a result, even if they experienced human rights violations, they don't perceive those as human rights violations. Second, it should be noted that North Korean Human Rights Act was passed in South Korean Congress in last March, and we need to explore the meaning of the passage of this act. After the passage of this act, government agencies such as the Ministry of Unification, the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Foreign Affairs are trying to prepare for the upcoming implementation of this act in September. I believe the core task forward is to make a collaborative network to gather accurate data and information about the North Korean human rights situation, accumulate that information systematically, and clarify perpetrators and victims in the process of information gathering and data accumulation process. At the same time, it is also important to assist various NGOs working for protecting North Korean human rights based on the establishment of North Korean Human Rights Foundation in South Korea. By passing North Korean Human Rights Act, I believe South Korean government shows a strong will to improve North Korean human rights and the living standard of North Koreans. However, there is still a division of opinions regarding the core issue of North Korean human rights. In order to implement this act more effectively, the South Korean government should play a pivotal role in mediating and reconciling between various human rights NGOs and lead to a minimum consensus on the basic ideas and principles of implementing North Korean Human Rights Act, such as the definition of North Korean human rights, the exact meaning of improving North Korean human rights in this act, etc. By clarifying these issues, it might be possible that the South Korean government make an effective strategy to improve human rights for North Koreans in the context of South Korea's broader North Korea and unification policies. Third, it is very important that the international community and the South Korean government could be able to closely cooperate with each other in clarifying North Korean human rights violations and implementing effectively policies to improve the situation. I think OHCHR Seoul office could facilitate this collaborating process between the South Korean government and the international community. In this sense, I believe KINU as a South Korean government think tank will play a core role in providing more accurate data and information regarding the North Korean human rights situation. We plan to collaborate closely with OHCHR Seoul office in this regard. For instance, KINU will publish white paper in this coming July and special reports in issue areas such as torture in North Korea and North Korean women and children's rights within this year. I also heard UN Seoul office will soon release its special report on separated family issues and plans to publish special report on human rights violations in pre-trial stages within North Korea's judicial system. As these examples imply, UN and the South Korean government would be able to strategically and collaboratively select the specific issue areas regarding North Korean human rights. make reports on these issues, and spread important information based on this collaboration effort. Last but not least, I would like to appreciate genuine efforts of various NGOs and human rights activists to improve North Korean human rights. I believe the international community begins to witness tangible results of these various efforts. In the coming years, I look forward to seeing North Koreans who are living in the world that every North Korean citizen can enjoy freedom and liberty in their daily lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that perspective on what internally a country can do when the country is affected by the situation next door, and very challenging in terms of implementation of your own law in South Korea. The floor is open. Please introduce yourself as well, and I'd invite short comments or questions, please. At the back, please. Please. We can hear you. Can you
Oh, sweet. Thanks.
shout?
Yes, my name is Geert Scholt. I'm from the Netherlands. And well, I had a question. Well, I have a million questions, but I'll try to keep it short. I don't really feel that the how question is adequately answered so far, to be honest. But I would like to address the concept of accountability from a slightly different angle, and which is, what is our accountability in this? Because since you say there's been such a big progress in information about what kind of human rights are being violated in North Korea right now, then why do we only write down what they're doing wrong, and why do we only get names on papers? And why is there not an active, because countries have been invaded for less, why is there not more an active approach to end human rights violations as soon as possible? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. More measures. Yes, I'll take 2 or 3 more, and then we'll come to the panel. The lady, please. A microphone, please. At the front. I'll try and reflect gender balance.
네, 저는 아까 말씀드린 걸 잊어먹었습니다. 일본에서 가와사키 에이코라고 합니다. 자그마한 NGO 모두 모이자라는 NGO의 대표를 하고 있습니다. 그래, 이 두 번째 제목에서는 how라는 것을 주제로 한다고 하였습니다. 물론 연구하고 기록하고 논쟁하는 것도 중요합니다. 그러나 이제는 행동할 때라고 생각합니다. 북한 사람들은 너무나도 지치고 있습니다. 북한 전체 백성들은 이 인권이 무엇인지조차도 모르고 살고 있습니다. 그러나 300만 명 이상이 굶어 죽은 고난의 시대를 통해서 지금에 이르기까지 너무나도 생활이 고달프고 힘들기 때문에 내가 있을 때 북한 사람들은 누구한테 비밀이 새지 않는다 생각한 대상에 대해서는 이야기를 했었어요. 오른쪽이든 왼쪽이든 괜찮아. 아무 쪽이라도 되니까 이 사회가 뒤집어 엎어버려라. 이렇게 희망을 가지고 있습니다. 지금도 안타깝게 이 북한 사회가 변할 것을 갈망하고 있습니다. 그러나 내부에서는 일어나지 못합니다. 그렇기 때문에 외부적으로 우리가 행동할 때가 되었다고 생각하는데 선생님들은 어떻게 생각하십니까?
Thank you very much. The gentleman next door, please. Thank you. And then we'll go back over there, and then we'll come to the panel after 4.
Hi. I think both sessions really did reflect how complex this issue is, and I think many ways, I think the panel perhaps think that there are ways and measures that we can take, as in investigate and record, but I think audience do share that this is about the how. So I was also wondering then, because there's a lot of time, I think, because I don't know what the end game is here, but North Korea, I don't see any signs of collapsing, or I don't know about the expert opinions, but and would it be a South-led unification? And also at the same time, there are instances where Cuba right now is resuming diplomatic ties, and do you think that's going to be another international case of trading diplomacy for human rights victims? So in saying that, while we have time, human rights needs to be on the forefront. And I was just wondering, what do you think the UN could possibly do to improve human rights? Like the director of Kino mentioned, is it helping South Korean NGOs or supporting NGO activities? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more, and then come back. And we'll do second round, hopefully. Yep, at the back. Yeah, in the middle. Gentlemen, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the very informative panel today. My name is Youngmin Kwon. I'm a student at Georgetown Law Center in the DC. I'm also an Amnesty International activist in DC, so it's really nice to meet fellow Amnesty members. So I didn't expect to meet a family member today in this setting. I have two very specific questions. First one is with respect to what Mr. Genser, is it? I'm really bad with names. I was really interested. I was very fascinated by the mention of the use of the method of mock trial in resolving the North Korean human rights situation. I've never considered the concept of mock trial as a solution for concrete international human rights crisis. And it seems it's not really going to be a mock trial. It's you envision a mechanism where we bring together actual victims, where they will tell their stories. I've never heard of a tactic like that. Has there been a precedent? And if so, what do you consider as major hurdles to make that mechanism possible? That's my first question. And my second question is with respect to the role of the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul. Mr. Han from the KINU said that the NGOs in South Korea and the South Korean government will play a major role in trying to close the gap of disagreements. I'm sorry, let me rephrase. Mr. Han said that the South Korean government ought to play a major role in trying to close the gap between all those disagreements that exist among the NGOs. And you mentioned the definitions of the specific crimes and those principles as the example of the things the South Korean government should be active in trying to close the disagreements. When I heard that, I was a bit taken aback, but it seems that those principles should be international principles that you use. So what would be the role of the UN office? And so is it simply as a collecting the evidence or trying to facilitate and closing the gaps of those disagreements? So that's my question. So what the role of the UN office is. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll turn to our UN friends and then all the panel.
Okay, I'll try to respond to some of the questions, although recognizing that these are very complex and probably not questions that will be, in a way, answered today in a satisfactory way. But I think in terms of the first questions that were asked about what can the UN do and how should the UN, why haven't we done more and why aren't we doing more? I think it's a fair question, and I think globally it's a fair question. One of the things it made me think of is the current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's initiative that's called Rights Up Front. And what that initiative does is it actually says all agencies, all UN entities in any discussions or assistance programs or any kind of actions they're taking must put human rights at the very center of their programming. This is making internally in the UN, but also in terms of what's happening at the country level with UN country teams, is making quite a significant difference. So you will now see country teams, that is organizations like UNICEF or like UNDP or World Health Organization and World Food Organization going and talking to the governments that they deal with, including the government of North Korea, about human rights and about how their programs can integrate human rights. So that's just one other way of approaching this, and it feeds into this holistic idea of we use the General Assembly, we use the Security Council, we have the accountability, but we also try in all aspects to integrate human rights in the UN's work. Having said that, of course, North Korea, it must be recognized, is a member state of the United Nations, and so, far be it for us to say that we should go against the UN mechanisms and the way the UN works. Yeah. The role of the UN office in Seoul is actually fairly specifically mandated by the international community through the Human Rights Council, but also the General Assembly, who's then recognized it. So what we really focus on is the international aspect, and that is the monitoring and documentation done in accordance with UN standards and OHCHR tried and tested methods for human rights investigations, and then outreach and information sharing. And that includes technical cooperation with various governments, and that may be part of what you're asking, government of North Korea when that's possible, but also other related governments, government of Japan, government of the ROK, where we can work together on ensuring that these human rights standards are respected. And that, by the way, also includes looking at things like treaty committees and reporting to those. So I think that's enough from me.
Please. Yes.
I share the profound frustrations expressed by the speakers from the floor, why the international community simply recognize the problems and do not take immediate and decisive actions. In fact, I have heard a lot of similar questions when I was in Geneva. In fact, in dealing with the human rights questions in international community, we have witnessed the continuous conflicts between the sovereignty versus universalities. In fact, there are many countries, including North Korea and other countries, which put the sovereignty over any other the rights, including the human rights. It is therefore there is a responsibility for international community to protect and promote North Korean human rights, but we have to recognize there are apparent limitations of international community to take actions for the time being. In fact, the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect, was discussed, and the concept was evolved actually many years, but this concept was never materialized in the UN system yet. And UN Security Council took the agenda of North Korean human rights issues just for discussions. They are not ready to take actions because of the politics. I mean, the standing conflicts between sovereignty versus the universalities. In that sense, I think the international community, actually, regardless of the states, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations, should work together actually in more creative and determined way to collect evidences more and more, and to prepare for such a time that we can take actions in the future. I think it is not that much discouraging because the work of COI just completed a couple of years ago, and international community just drew attention to the atrocities of North Korea's human rights violations, and we are now exploring the avenues available to us. Thank you.
Christine?
On the same question, I think the frustration about only documenting or only gathering evidence for something in the future, I think is very simplistic, because on the one hand, there is parallel processes going on. We have attempts by other human rights mechanisms to engage with North Korea, but I think because of the lack of political will on the part of the North Korean government, there is not so much progress through those other mechanisms. But the treaty bodies, I think they've just received reports, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I don't know if CEDAW also received the reports. But these are also ongoing. And so this accountability question is, I mean, that's the subject of today's discussion, but it's not going on in a vacuum. That said, I think we do also need to be creative about how we address ending human rights violations in North Korea. And for example, one of the projects that I'm engaged with is looking at the issue of North Korean labor outside of North Korea. So the forced, I think we have enough evidence to argue that the labor that is sent abroad is forced labor. And I'm not going to go in depth into this. We have a final report actually coming out next week. But this gives us another channel because some of the forced labor is going on in the European Union. And so that gives us a different platform to engage on the issue of human rights violations stemming from the forced labor. We have also possibilities now to work with the ILO and to engage the mechanisms available there. So I think it's a challenge to constantly to come up with new ways of trying to address the violations. And I think David Hawk actually offered a very good proposal for taking action, in the situation that we have today. And I think collecting evidence, raising the issue of accountability, it's not just for the sake of collecting documents or collecting video. There's also an attempt to send a strong message to leaders in North Korea, which is, we're doing this, and this is not because we need to collect more papers or more documents. It's because we're watching, we're documenting, and this is where we're trying to go with this. And that has to have, hopefully, some I would think some of the political elite are a little bit worried, more than they were before the work of the Commission of Inquiry, before the current attempts to address accountability. And so I don't think it's fair to categorize the efforts to achieve accountability as a very sort of separate and non-active process.
Thank you. Jared?
Yeah, so I want to begin. I neglected in my opening remarks to thank Ambassador Lee and all the organizers for having me, so thank you. I was just so enthusiastic, I jumped right in. Let me just address two issues here. First, I understand the tremendous desire for a dramatic move to justice and accountability. There were some of the questioners asking about why don't people have invaded on lesser items. I think the bottom line comes back to the way that the international system is organized in the 21st century from the 20th century with the UN and the adoption of the Responsibility to Protect in 2005, which was intended to not enable governments to unilaterally intervene on humanitarian grounds for whatever reasons they so decided, but in fact to say that all states have a duty to stop mass atrocity crimes taking place within their borders, or let alone not commit them. And if they're unable or unwilling to discharge those responsibilities, then it's the obligation of the UN system up through and including Chapter 7 action by the UN Security Council to address that situation. And so that is of no satisfaction, I'm sure, to the many victims that I've met of North Korean human rights abuses who have suffered immensely, and the many ongoing victims every single day in North Korea that are suffering. But this is the system that we have, and I don't think we want to live in a world in which any country in the world can decide to invade any other country with no cause or consequence because they decide that there are, in their minds, human rights abuses. And as bad as that may be, in the case of a North Korea where we might think that it could be justifiable, practically speaking, it will work in lots of unpleasant directions in the other direction were anyone in the international community to want to go in that route. So I think we have to work with the international system that we have. Just very briefly on the idea of a mock trial or a tribunal, I wasn't suggesting it's a solution in any respect to the issues of justice and accountability. But what I was suggesting was that it is one of a number of different means to shine a bright light on what's happening in North Korea and to create momentum and pressure for achieving access to or a creating of a new accountability mechanism. These kinds of tribunals have a long history. I was just quickly looking at my phone after you asked the question. It goes back to the Russell Tribunal, which was done in the 1960s, looking at American foreign policy and military intervention in Vietnam. David lived through that era, so he'll have more of a memory of it than I, who was not alive. But it was, and then subsequent tribunals have been created on Chile, 1974, Iraq, 2004, Palestine, 2009. The idea would be, though, let's just look at North Korea rather than the precedent. But the idea would be to get a group of extraordinary luminaries to take, in essence, what Justice Kirby and his colleagues did, which attracted an intense visibility from the UN system, and to take it, to extend that work more broadly. And so to look at getting a group of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, former presidents and prime ministers, to be able to be members of such a tribunal, right, who could attract the media visibility around this, to bring in victims to speak in personal terms about what they had been through, to probably focus on a narrower set of crimes, not the whole story, but to focus on a set of crimes that can be told in a public, digestible, accessible manner, and then have the kind of intense visibility that engaging global luminaries would have in order to tell the story of what's happening in North Korea, to send the message, as Christine was saying, inside North Korea, that this is what it's going to look like for you, and you should beware. And it would be really just a simple, not simple to organize, but a straightforward way to try to start to paint a picture for what needs to happen next in a way that people can understand, and then can be taken by the media, projected internationally. Hopefully then also the findings of that tribunal and that work could then be presented by luminaries like Nobel Peace Laureates to an ARIA formula briefing of the Security Council, right? And it can be used to then engage the UN system in a range of ways, and to try to help elevate the need for greater resources for the OHCHR here in Seoul, for example. All these things could be achieved by having a tribunal.
Dong-Hoo.
Yeah, thank you. I think now is a very important time to collaborate with each other, because in South Korea, we have now North Korean Human Rights Act, and also we have UN OHCHR office in Seoul here. So technically speaking, I think we have full potential to change North Korean human rights. The problem I see is in the process of passing North Korean human rights, there is still non-consensus about what is North Korean human rights and how do we promote human rights. And I think there is some gap between international consensus about accountability issue on the one hand, and then South Korean domestic opinion about North Korean human rights promotion. So I think one of the main role of UN OHCHR office is the filling the gap between this international standard and domestic consensus. We are preparing for some kind of implementation process of North Korean Human Rights Act. In September, this law is more detailed, implemented. So I think we have 2 or 3 months before implementation of this North Korean Human Rights Act. So I think now is the time to collaborate with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final round? Yes, very quick questions or comments? Yes, James? Go ahead, James. Mike's coming.
This is actually a question for you, Vitit. I was wondering if you could, with your experience of the COI in Syria, if you could maybe talk briefly on the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which I believe was set up by ICC veterans and has trained Syrian refugees in evidence collection, which is case ready for any sort of future prosecutions. And we're thinking creatively about what can happen in the North Korean situation. And I'm just wondering how this works with the UN process, with the COI, and if you think this could be transferred to the North Korean situation, where we're not sending North Korean refugees back into North Korea to collect evidence, but it's along those sort of lines.
Yes, please. Our friend here. Any more at the back? Okay, 2 more? Any more? All right, we have 2 more after this. Yes, please.
I have come from Japan. I have a frustration. We have the responsibility for the solution of the political prison camps in North Korea. we must make the roadmap to solve it. We expect to experts group. We expect they make the roadmap. Thank you.
Thank you. The word roadmap, yes. One, two more. Short, sharp.
Summer intern for Teach North Korean refugees. And I'm probably one of the youngest members here, and as a representative of some of the younger generation that's now coming up, I just wanted to ask, how can we, just the general public, the younger generation, take action to help with this issue? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, young generation, very important. Yes, two more at the back, quick, please.
Thank you. Good to see you here once again, Hubert. My name is Hubert Lee, and I'm the Chief Director of Transition Justice Working Group, which we established 2 years ago, right after the COI report release. So what we are doing is, this is for your information actually, because we haven't exposed our products, what it is to the public yet. So what we are doing is using technologies to detect locations of mass graves in North Korea. And so over the past 1 year, we test interviews with 100 North Korean defectors. We could identify at least 7 sites that are hidden in Korea. So what's inspired us to do this was that the reminding of the case of Cambodia was that it turned out that after the 4 years of the Khmer Rouge regime, it turned out that so far over 20,000 sites, hidden mass grave sites, are identified yet so far, right? So our direction is to what we should do next after COI is become more practical and practically correcting the tangible evidence is. So we see a great possibility to use to invite information technology experts and also forensic science too. And so please consider if you have next meetings and using technologies. And we don't use that much so far, but we have to use it. So from now on. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more? One more, last, very short, 1 minute, please.
Hello, I'm Edward Howell-Base. I'm a researcher based at Oxford University. I'm just very interested in the nature of comparison. A lot of the panelists in both this morning's discussion and this discussion have talked about the nature of comparison between the DPRK and with other countries. We've heard about Syria, Myanmar, to name but a few. To what extent do you think that this comparison is actually useful in providing us with a way forward, a roadmap, a path forward, especially with the uniqueness of the situation in DPRK?
That's it from the participants there, and I'll come to our panelists, about 1 minute each, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'll skip the questions that were directed to Vitit, because I know very little about the Syria situation compared to you. But yes, we would very much hope that the group of independent experts would give us some direction in where you're going, just to respond to the first question. How can the younger generation take action to help? The younger generation, I think it's very clear, is absolutely key to any future. And we're not talking only about the younger generation of North Koreans who are in South Korea, and of course South Korean and international youth, but also the younger generation within the DPRK, who are the ones who we all know are having access to outside information to an extent that they never did in the past, and who are really key to also creating change from inside, which in the longer term will make change sustainable when it happens. So that's not really a how, but just that you are, and that the younger generation can be creative and move these processes forward in a way that is crucial. Using technology, absolutely. We are also starting to look at that in the UN and use of satellite. And of course, this comes in a context where we do not have access on the ground, which is something quite unique compared to other places. We have no access, so any kind of initiatives that can give us concrete on-the-ground information, of course, is very important, and we need to learn much more about that and utilize that. And I think I'll stop here.
The COI reported that the magnitude of human rights violations in North Korea is unparalleled in the contemporary world. Therefore, I think it's very difficult to compare the situation with other countries' situation. Regarding actually what to do, I think this, we have to get concerted effort to get international and global support in our joint efforts. The role of education for the younger generation to provide accurate information on North Korea's human rights violations is very important. And the role of media, like the movies, and then modern technology like IT technology and then forensic technology would also be very much important tool to accumulate evidences for the future the prosecutions. Thank you.
Christine.
I think what's unique here in South Korea is that there are some 30,000 North Koreans who are living here, who've managed to make it here and have asylum. And I think perhaps the engagement with this community is not where it could be. And this would be a good start, particularly for young people. I think there are many needs within this community. I think somebody earlier was speaking to sort of the big gap in terms of the psychological and social support that's available to people after they've left North Korea. And I also extremely grateful for you for raising the issue of refoulement and of looking at transit countries, namely China. And I think again we need to look at solving the problem in many different ways. And China, I've always made the argument, is really key in helping to resolve what's going on in North Korea. And so perhaps the engagement at the political level could be stepped up, or at least done again in a more creative fashion, because we haven't made much progress with that. So those would be my suggestions.
Thank you, Christine.
3 points briefly. For the younger generation question, if you're based in South Korea, I would urge you and your colleagues to do as much as you can in assisting the integration of North Korean refugees/defectors. In regards to the question about a mock tribunal, there would be at least one member of this panel that thinks as long as the issue of accountability is being tackled by real nations in the real world, that mock NGOs tribunals would be diversionary. And on the issue of roadmaps, Marzuki could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the task of the panel of experts on accountability is exactly to provide a roadmap on the accountability issue narrowly. And in terms of a larger roadmap, I thought that the 2 tracks outlined by the COI actually provided the roadmap for moving forward. The accountability track is still being pursued. It's still a real live issue. All of the recommendations from the COI on engaging and dialogue, they're all rendered a bit problematic because of the resurgence of security issues, the missile tests and the nuclear weapons development tests, and the resultant Security Council increase in sanction has caused a roadblock to the kinds of pursuit of human rights dialogue that Marzuki was working hard on, and the COI was, had advanced. But in terms of an overall roadmap, I think the ones provided by the COI are very much alive and well. And the group of experts, we hope, will come up with a more advanced, detailed roadmap on accountability in particular.
Thank you. Jared.
I think that there's no easy or rapid solution to justice and accountability on North Korea. But we all know that the situation in North Korea is terrible. And we all know that it needs to be addressed with a dramatic sense of urgency. And despite the slow pace of movement forward, when I think back, now having been involved on North Korean human rights work for a decade, we actually have come a long way in the international community in terms of thinking about and talking about and analyzing and explaining and telling the stories of what is happening in North Korea. It has still not had a major impact on ameliorating the suffering of the North Korean people, nor has it achieved any justice and accountability that one can easily point to. But we have to persevere. There is no choice but to persevere. We know if we do nothing, what's going to happen, and it's going to be more of the same. And just because it's impossible, as it appears to be at this moment in time, doesn't mean that we don't have to pursue it nonetheless. I would just reaffirm what David said about the roadmap being in the COI report, and I agree fully that the group of experts will be able to put more flesh on that. I do think that we need to think creatively about the kinds of ways that we can garner the kind of public attention that we need that can move governments, because ultimately this still is not a mainstream issue that is on the minds of the public at large. And I think that until governments start to feel a compulsion to take action, you're not going to move the UN system in the ways that are really necessary. And I think that at the same time, I would also say that as we move down the justice and accountability track, we also have to continue to try all ways possible to engage with North Korea to ameliorate the ongoing suffering of the North Korean people. And I would just say, as one illustration of that, I was involved in a project a number of years ago that actually was able to access North Korea and immunize several million people for Japanese encephalitis, children. And this was something that happened despite all the nuclear and missile issues going on and everything else. And we need to look at those kinds of ongoing ways to ameliorate suffering.
Okay, I agree. Young people are very important to the future of the Korean Peninsula. So I think we need to engage and educate young people, regardless of their nationality. North Koreans, South Koreans have more common ground. So we need to educate and talk about human rights issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, our great panelists. And I would like just to round off by adding a few final comments before applauding you very warmly. There were some questions to me, and I'd like to integrate them into my summary for you. I think the sort of roadmap for or on accountability that we're looking to is already guided by the COI's work. It's actually guided by many COI's work. We have had, for the past 30, 40 years, some 50 commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions under the United Nations. So there's a lot of wisdom learned already, which invites better implementation. From my perspective of some of the components of the roadmap, listening to us here and learning from elsewhere, I would include these. Number one, and they're not priorities as such, but intermingled, they're connected. Please don't forget about humanitarian assistance and protection. People still need humanitarian help unconditionally. 10 million are food insecure in North Korea. Likewise, those exiting need to be protected from refoulement. So it is a question of humanitarian assistance and protection with many ramifications. Secondly, documentation, very important. It's a means to an end. And for us, it's a historical narrative, but it's also a narrative with a view to accountability. And that's the agenda of the day. The sort of documentation, the evidence we should be gathering is primary source evidence, direct evidence from witnesses and victims on a confidential basis in the database, corroborated, cross-checked, so that you're halfway towards possible indictment rather than just general statements from a witness. And that's very important because NGOs can help us access the victims, but we, the interviewers, must go directly to the victims and cross-check the information. That is how it's done in other commissions of inquiry, halfway to criminal responsibility. Thirdly, investigation, prosecution, and enforcement come implementation. And that opens the door to many levels of possibilities. Of course, we call for multilaterally access to the International Criminal Court and or an ad hoc tribunal. But it's very difficult because to date it's dependent upon the consent of the P5 of the Security Council. So what are the other entry points then? Well, what about national level or bilateral assistance? We have countries that can use national jurisdiction and or universal jurisdiction against perpetrators, particularly countries that are affected by the misdeeds of some North Koreans, particularly vis-a-vis their own nationals. I mean, classically, South Korea is affected. Classically, Japan is affected. These countries can take action already, at least in terms of listing persons for prosecution, on the basis of national jurisdiction, because their nationals have been affected. Or you can use a broader perspective of universal jurisdiction. And incidentally, other commissions of inquiry have prepared confidential lists of perpetrators already from their own information base. Why confidential? Because we're waiting for the trials, and then we will release at that point in time with regard to due process of law. Fourth, the question of leveraging with the country of origin and the authorities. Some people have said some engagement. Some people have said more assertive action under the United Nations Security Council, Chapter 7. There can be both in a graduated manner, using the totality of the UN system to leverage. And then finally, fifth, the question of victim accessibility and centrality. The victims must be heard, and that's why we're here. Together with civil society participation, young people's mobilization to understand, to nurture empathy for those who've been suffering, and to ensure that accountability has to be understood as part of the quest for justice, which is a long road. It's a process, it's a long process. But we must not give up, because we are here to be a living testament together to the fact and the commitment that with good information, with good advocacy, with good partnership, we must act now. Thank you to the panelists.
예, 감사합니다. 패널들 저장님께 뜨거운 박수 부탁드립니다. 이상으로 오전 식순이 모두 끝났습니다.